I think we're now approaching 20%. I think it's been steadily going up, and I think it will continue to go up as we get more sophisticated with how we treat cancer and other diseases like that. But for example, the newest chemotherapy drugs cost up to 2.5. I saw one cost $5 billion to get that to market. And one treatment regimen was costing $1 million a year per patient. So the more sophisticated we get with promoting health, or treating disease, I should say, the more it's going to cost. And that's why we, in this group of people that believe in whole food, plant-based nutrition, that we know, based on reversing of heart disease and cancer and type 2 diabetes, that particularly in the first and the last, the heart disease and the type 2 diabetes, they're reversible about over 90% of the time if people shift and stay with a whole food, plant-based diet. So all in all, if everyone moved to that diet, the cost of healthcare would probably drop 80%. And the only kind of doctors we would need would be the acute care doctors when we injure ourselves, or we'd need cosmetic surgeons and obstetricians and the good kind of doctors, the fun doctors. But our healthcare system is out of control. It's money motivated. We don't teach doctors in med school how to promote health. We teach them how to treat disease. Doctors, I think they're a great bunch of people that all went into the profession basically to help people. And I just feel for them when they find out they're trapped in a system that means they have to visit with patients who have already been sold on a drug before they got there. He's got 7 minutes, he or she's got 7 minutes with that patient. And even if they wanted to convert them and help them promote health, they wouldn't have time. And if they did convert them, the patient wouldn't come back again because they would get healthy. So the whole system is an absolute mess. It's not getting any better. This Biden moonshot cancer initiative, they're not stepping outside the cancer castle, as Dr. Campbell calls it. Those are people who specialize in cancer treatment. Nobody in the cancer industry, according to my research, is actually searching for a true cure of cancer. They're searching for ways to treat cancer that will go on for as long as you live, and hopefully they'll keep you alive long enough to extract a lot of money from you, your insurance company, your government. So I hate to use only, but the only pragmatic way out of this mess is a huge change in diet, and the special interest of the food companies, the pharmaceutical companies, the overall way Congress works, being held accountable to their constituents. Just not popular to talk about giving up meat. And until something big happens, and in my mind, I just spoke about this earlier, the way out of this whole mess, which also includes environmental disasters, is, I think, a massive global awareness campaign, taking the message about what we're doing to our bodies and what we're doing to our planet, taking that message directly to the people that are eating most of the harmful products for ourselves and for the planet, and explaining to them what needs to happen. And I think that kind of process, led by a leader that's as passionate as I am about the topic, but has a few more $1 billion than I do and has global name recognition. I think it boils down to, one person with the right level of conviction and the right amount of influence ability could change the world, because that person could build a team and could organize a global awareness campaign. Now, people ask me, well, how much would that cost? And I said, well, everything is relative. And I see where Facebook just bought a company called WhatsApp for $22 billion. Now, a good portion of the world's population don't even know what WhatsApp is. It's an app for your iPhone or your smartphone. And if an app for a smartphone is worth $22 billion, what is the future of our civilization worth? So it really boils down to that, and I don't like to sound like I'm talking about doom and gloom, and so I always interject the fact that I've sorted it down to 4 key categories of unsustainability in our world. The first is overpopulation. We're growing at the rate of over 200,000 people a day. During this 10-day conference, we added another 2 million people to the planet. Secondly, the way that population lives, the way we consume stuff. We have a global economy based on the maximization of the consumption of stuff in a world of finite resources. And thirdly, you take those first 2 problems of an ever-expanding, exploding population, coupled with the fact that people are moving up the food chain all over the world. They're beginning to drive cars for the first time. They're beginning to eat meat for the first time. So we have an explosion on all these fronts. And those are driving number 3, which is our burning of fossil fuels. All of those things take fuel. And we're nowhere when it comes to replacing fossil fuels with the renewables. So those are the first 3 areas. Here's the good news. The good news is that changing what we eat on a massive scale is possible to happen very quickly. I say it's possible. It is impossible to change the way people move around the world very quickly and change it from one that consumes a lot of energy to one that, is total mass transportation. So it's the only thing that we can do quickly. The other 3, I say, would take many decades, if not centuries, to fix, and we just simply don't have that much time. Well, the first humans, we did descend from other forms of life, and the animal in the wild that's closest to our DNA, almost 100%, is the gorilla. The gorilla's natural diet is whole plants. As humans also have a cognitive niche. That's what got us in trouble. We also started moving around and populating the planet. Well, if you've moved yourself to Alaska, you can't have fresh vegetables in the wintertime. So you learn to live, humans adapted, and humans throughout the ages have eaten whatever they could find. For most of that history, it was all unprocessed. It was probably a large percentage, a number between 60 and 80% or 90 possibly, depending on where they were living, was mostly plant-based foods, mostly grains, mostly things when they started growing, of course, most of human history, we didn't have farming. So they were eating whatever they could find. They were called hunters and gatherers. And depending on where they lived, they would gather first, but they would hunt later if they needed to, is the way I see it. Now, fast forward up to the 20th century. I was born in the middle of the 20th century. Right about the time that everybody was wealthy enough to have meat, dairy, eggs, and fish, or some combination, at almost every meal. And we were taught to believe, our parents were taught to believe, that that was the healthiest way to eat. You got to have this protein. Eggs are great. Cow's milk is the perfect food, and all of that. And that's about when the problem started. When food got cheap enough, when manufacturers were able to do the mass farming, the automation, all of the engineering process improvements to make food cheap, is when we ran into problems. When my parents were growing up, they couldn't afford to eat meat at every meal, and therefore it wasn't available at every meal. But later, it was available and people started doing it, and then lo and behold, the medical profession climbed on board. Our medical profession is pretty much controlled by our pharmaceutical industry. Our nutritional professional and our medical profession, nutritional professions are controlled by the dairy and the meat and the food industries. And so today, and the doctors now will tell you that the best diet would be to eat one that's heavy in animal protein. If someone were to leave this conference and go to their doctor next week and say, "Hey doctor, I went to this conference and I want to really think about going to a totally whole food plant-based diet," the chances right now are 10 to 1 that patient would hear more words of caution than he or she would hear of encouragement. So what we have is basically a system that got away from itself in terms of animal-based foods. Humans have always wanted to eat. It's natural to want to eat something that tastes good and to want to eat something that fills you up and is calorie dense, because the more calories you can eat at one time, the less hunting you got to do to get your next calories. So we're kind of a victim of our own intelligence, ingenuity, and ability to make things easy that were once difficult and make them inexpensive, so that everybody in the United States practically is eating some form of meat, dairy, eggs, fish, or highly processed foods at every single meal. And this is when the question was about healthcare costs. This is when they really started going out of control. Was in the 60s when it was 5%, and now it's 20%. And unless something changes, it will get to 30%. But I can't imagine it happening, because we're bankrupting families and nations, and we simply have to find a way to get back to the natural diet for our species, and we owe it to our grandchildren and for the future of this our civilization. Yesterday, I heard one of the lecturers talking a lot about the GMOs, and she said most of the GMOs in the United States are going into products that feed either cows or cars. So I've often thought, and I'm not an expert by any means on GMOs. I avoid them. I would rather eat organic. And I truly believe if we were successful in causing a gigantic shift in the direction of whole food, plant-based diet, that we would, by virtue of that step, we would eliminate the need for most of the GMOs that are taking place, because most of them going into animal feed. So back to the question, the part about getting the protein and the right amount of nutrients that we need. According to Dr. T. Colin Campbell, who is a friend of mine and a colleague, Cornell professor, and various MDs that I know that are working in this field, the ideal combination of carbohydrate, protein, and fat is 80-10-10. There are only 3 macronutrients. We need some of all of them. None of them is more important than the other ones. We need fat. We don't need 40% of our calories from fat. We need 10 or less. We need 10% of our calories from protein. Average American is getting 40% of their calories from fat and about 20% from protein. And as Dr. Campbell showed in the lab with laboratory animals 50 years ago, by raising the diet in the animals from 5% casein, which is animal protein from cow's milk, raising it from 5% to 20% promoted cancer in a big way in the animals. Moving it back to 5%, the cancer didn't grow anymore. So that supports the case that if we can eat some animal protein if that's all we've got to eat, but we need it to be less than 10% of our dietary intake, probably. Now, the people that lived on fish in Alaska when they were natives up there, that might have been 100% of their diet. Well, they probably didn't live that long either. They probably died in their 30s, but that's neither here nor there. The fact is that if you eat a variety of whole plants, and you get most of your calories from the stuff that fills you up, the starches like grains and beans and potatoes, you'll wind up getting your 80-10-10 without even thinking about it. And if you want to make sure you don't gain too much weight doing this thing, you avoid the high-fat plants, which are things like avocado, nuts, and seeds, which are up in the 70-80% fat range. So this is such a simple situation, such a simple solution, but probably nothing has ever been more difficult in the history of the world, even World War II. If we could mobilize ourselves toward this effort like we mobilized ourselves for World War II after Pearl Harbor, we could get this done easily. But we've got to have some leadership, and we've got to have some money. This will be a short answer because I don't know much about genetics.
Okay.
But I do know that it's kind of like a gun. Genetics cocks the gun, so to speak. Lifestyle pulls the trigger. So the fact that, people say they got cancer because of their bad genes in their family, well, the science shows that, and I'm co-authoring a book at the current time, and the working title is Downsizing the Cancer Industry, by sharing publicly the science behind cancer's favorite food, which it turns out to be animal protein. So the fact remains in huge countries where the population subsisted on 90% plants and maybe 5 or 10% meat, dairy as condiments, really, in some of these developing countries, cancer was almost unheard of. Yet when those same people moved to the United States and Europe, within a generation, they're having the same incidence of cancer, heart disease, all of the diseases of affluence. They were once called diseases of affluence because only the wealthier people got it. So that's kind of the answer there. I think genetics is not something we solve by creating drugs that fit your gene structure. It's by eating the right damn food for our bodies. It's so simple to me. I have been accused of oversimplifying things, but if there was ever a need in this world to get something simple, it's what we should be eating. I've watched a few old movies in my time, and I've seen photos of wartime era, and everybody looks so skinny. You look at a cruise ship, and all these people boarding the cruise ship, they were all very thin, thinner than I am even, and I'm pretty skinny by today's standards. And I think back in school when I was in the first grade in Mississippi back in 1951. There were one or two overweight kids. Maybe there's, I don't know why they were overweight, but it wasn't a big deal before people started eating meat, dairy, eggs, and fish, before people started going from 10% of their diet was fat to 40% is fat, and having it at every meal, and also having almost no whole plants, which are really the promoters of health. So I think obesity is one of those things that would have never happened in a big way. It wouldn't be called a chronic disease. It would just be that some people are prone to get overweight, and it's 0.5% of the population. That's the way I see it, having grown up and seeing how things have changed. And now when I fly, which is not that often anymore, but when I fly, I'm just amazed at the percentage of obese people. By the way, one of our presidential candidates is on TV today with Dr. Oz. And they were reviewing his medical, and he asked Dr. Oz to do this. This is Donald Trump, of course. And I saw it today. Someone had looked at the transcript of that video, and turns out Donald Trump is 6'2", weighs 267 pounds. He is technically, by the definition, obese. And so, he wasn't obese when he was in military school. I saw pictures of him. But he loves his fast food, just like Bill Clinton did back when he was in the White House. He owns a steak company. He's eaten meat, dairy, eggs, and fish and highly processed foods at every meal his entire life. And I believe that when you eat that way your entire life, I think you already have heart disease. Dr. Esselstyn found when he studied the records of fallen soldiers in Korea, American soldiers. When they did autopsies, they found the arteries of the Koreans were clean. These guys had eaten nothing but plants most of their life. The American soldiers back in World War II were already, at the time when everybody thought that you had to have a lot of meat, dairy, eggs, and fish. And guess what? 80% of those dead soldiers, autopsies revealed that they had advanced atherosclerosis in their veins. They already had heart disease. It just hadn't manifested itself with usually the first symptom, which is a heart attack. Obesity is, on the other hand, you can tell if you're obese if you weigh yourself and look at yourself in the mirror. I believe there are some people prone to put on weight and others are not. I do believe, I've seen that. I know. I was a member of a yacht club in Connecticut for 10 years, and I looked at some of the people that were trim and fit, and they ate more meat, dairy, eggs, and fish than anybody had ever seen. They exercised probably a fairly good amount, but I think they are the exception. If you eat the standard American diet, I mean, you look at the broader data. And you look at the size of aircraft seats, and you look at, they're having to change the whole way airplanes fly. Planes have crashed because the aircraft industry didn't keep up with the fact that the passengers were no longer averaging 150 pounds. The men were averaging 200, and the women were averaging 180. And so that makes a difference when you're flying an airplane. And you got 150 of those people. I just saw Sully this week and feel like you're on that plane going down in the Hudson. The question I'm hearing is, what about medical treatment? And when you go this route, and this route of eating a whole food plant-based diet, what do you do about going to the doctor? Like most people were brought up in my generation that it's a good idea to go get a physical every year. Some companies require that of their executives and other people, and my companies required me to do that at one time. But then once I started learning all that I have learned, and I read a book by Mendelssohn, I think it was, Confessions of a Medical Heretic, an MD who realized the wrong path that medicine had taken when it comes to chronic disease. And once again, I have great admiration for doctors that went into the field to help people, and I still go to orthopedic surgeons. When I broke my wrist last January, I definitely went to have it looked at by the orthopedic people. I ruptured my Achilles tendon not too long ago. I've had accidents, and our acute care is second to none, and it's great to have those kinds of professionals. But once I realized that the people who were checking my vitals didn't have any clue about promoting health, it was all about getting me. I think the last time I went to a doctor to have a checkup, I was told that I was borderline hypertensive and need to take a blood pressure medicine and possibly get ready to start taking a statin. So that meant my cholesterol levels were probably in the low 200s at the time. And it kind of got my attention right about the time that I was reading and studying and deciding that I was going to change what I ate. I changed what I was eating primarily for health reasons, although I didn't have any particular health problems. I turned out to lose 20 pounds later, but I didn't really have any health problems. But I have since become more interested in sustainability as opposed to my health. I guess the older I get, I'm not that worried about it. But I really think, actually, since I first started studying this topic, I have not been back for another physical. I had to go to a doctor recently to get some Medicare to pay for physical therapy for my wrist, but I just don't think they have anything to help me with. So I don't get any tests. I'm not recommending that to anybody, not that anybody would take my advice about going to the doctor, because I have no medical credentials, but I am in charge of my own body. And I have opted out of the healthcare system. We've kind of discussed the fact that some people are maybe going to be overweight because of certain factors, thyroid or ancestry or whatever. But I think 90% of our obesity problem is food fueled. And so I think I would rather talk more about the prevention of chronic diseases and or the reversal of chronic diseases. With heart disease and diabetes, it's like over 90% success rate. If people just adhere to basically a very loosely defined whole food plant-based diet. Just eat whatever you like, eat a lot of plants, try to keep below 20% fat. And then in cancer, I could talk a little bit about my co-author, who I'm writing a book with that I mentioned earlier, called Downsizing the Cancer Industry. My co-author wrote the book, Stop Feeding Your Cancer. He wrote a book called Stop Feeding Your Cancer. It came out in late 2013. He had been referred to the China Study, the book by T. Colin Campbell, by a friend of his. And the friend worked in the cancer industry somewhat, and Dr. Kelly is my friend's name, had seen him at a funeral of a mutual friend, and they got to talking about what's new in the cancer industry. And his friend told him, John, if you want to know all about cancer, read this book. And he wrote down on his business card, The China Study by T. Colin Campbell. Handed that to John Kelly. That was in 2005, probably spring of 2005. The China Study had been out about 2 months. John Kelly bought the book, read it 2 or 3 times, couldn't believe what he was reading, mainly about cancer. It's also got chapters in there about heart disease and type 2 diabetes, but the cancer was really what got his attention, because not much has been written about that in terms of relating to food. So he was a general practitioner, had a long, prosperous practice, knew all of his patients very well. A lot of his patients had cancer. So he was thinking, my God, the information in this book is pretty compelling. And if it's right, if these lab experiments in animals are right, then if we remove animal protein, we'll cut off the favorite food of cancer. And so he went around to various physicians, oncologists that he knew, and they laughed at him. They said, this is ridiculous. You know, it's ridiculous to even think that animal protein, our most precious nutrient, could possibly cause cancer or promote cancer. And so he got laughed at by oncologists and other medical professionals. But he said, you know what? My friend recommended that to me. He knows a lot about cancer. And I would love for this. There needs to be a human trial of feeding cancer patients this kind of food and finding out the results, and have a control group and an intervention group and all of that. He could not interest anybody in the cancer industry to do that. So he said, well, I've got a patient base, and a good number of my patients have cancer, all different kinds of cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer. He had lots of different cancers going on, pancreas cancer. So what he did, he said, I'm going to have my own clinical trial. And it's going to be informal, because it's not going to be randomized, it's not going to be controlled, because I can't control what people eat when they're not with me. He just told him to read this book. He said, I think there's some information here that will help you. Try eating no animal protein for 1 month. and even told them they could have a little fish, because fish really hadn't been implicated as much as cow's milk and dairy and other forms of meat. And so his trial started. Patients started coming in. 100%, almost 100% of them reported feeling much better after 2-3 weeks on this. He told them to continue, obviously, their standard treatment with their oncologist. They went to see the oncologist. Some of them, he said basically, you probably shouldn't tell the oncologist about what you're doing. I'm not saying don't tell them, but you'll probably get ridiculed. And so when the patients did go and tell their oncologist, to the person, they were told, you're wasting your time, this is malarkey, it's not gonna help, it probably can't hurt. And after almost 10 years in that practice, he decided to put the results of his informal trial in a book. And he wrote the book, Stop Feeding Your Cancer. It was published in Ireland in late 2013. It covered examples of 70 patient stories, 70 patients with cancer. And he said he could tell you with no hesitation that of those 70 patients who followed and stayed on this animal protein free diet, he didn't even call it whole food plant-based, it was just quit eating the stuff that cancer likes to eat. And not a single one of those patients died. He had one patient that died, or one or two. The only exception was pancreatic cancer. And he explained it, he's a medical doctor and he studied it quite a bit. And he said with the pancreas, something different's going on. And it seemed to relate to the fact that the pancreas generates its own animal protein that feeds itself. It feeds the cancer. So that was his comment. We decided to write a new book, basically because he's having problems with his publisher. The book, they printed 5,000 copies. If you try to order that book online right now, on Amazon, for example, it's listed at $75 for a paperback. Now, nobody's going to be buying a $75 book, and it's used, by the way. You can buy an e-copy probably forever because they don't print those. That just automatically appears in your inbox. But the publisher he has is no longer printing the book, and I thought that we would write a book together telling parts of his story, parts of Campbell's story, scientific and medical kind of blended in with cancer. And we have that book almost finished, but there's a legal snag with his publisher, and we may not be able to publish the book, at least anything that he wrote, and for at least 2 or 3 more years. But that's the closest thing we have come to testing Campbell's lab findings that were 100%. The rats that were fed the 15%, 20% casein all died. The 100 rats that were fed 5% casein all lived. That's almost unheard of in the scientific world, to have 100 to nothing. And yet, that finding, the cancer industry has never seen fit to test that finding in humans. And according to Dr. Campbell, since the 60s, when he first started studying this, it's always been the rule in science that anything that causes cancers in rats will also cause cancers in humans. But the industry, which is all dependent on money, has never done a single clinical trial. We're in the process right now of raising money. I'm on the board of directors of the T. Colin Campbell Center for Nutrition Studies, and we are trying to raise $6 million to fund the first ever clinical trial, to being done by professionals with control group and intervention group, doing it right, to test the effects of a whole food plant-based diet on cancers of all kinds. That we need to raise $6 million, which is like pocket change if you want to compare that to the cost bringing one chemo drug to market, which can be as high as $5 billion. So it's a frustrating topic. All I know about is the science that has been conducted with respect to animal protein, and the laboratory results in India and Campbell's laboratory results. He did 50 studies at Cornell University, where he was the leading nutritional scientist, arguably in the world, in terms of the number of studies that he directed and the millions of dollars of funding that he acquired from places like the National Institutes of Health. But I don't know of any studies testing the effects of an all-sugar diet on animals versus whatever. I just don't. Most parents agree that added sugar is not good for their children, but most parents think that eating yogurt is good for their children. And here's the big disconnect. A whole food plant-based diet might have a lot of sugar in it, and that's what confuses people. Fruit has a lot of sugar in it, but it's a complex carbohydrate. It's millions of things going on when that fruit goes into your stomach, and the acids and all of the processes take place. Dr. Campbell can't explain even a fraction of what goes on. There's just so many things that happen when we put food in our bodies, and different foods have different levels of carbohydrate, fat, and protein, and a lot of them have sugar, but they're natural sugars. It's a total difference than table sugar you put on your cereal or put in your coffee, or the added sugar that goes into just about everything, every processed food that we eat. Sugar is a big deal, and it's gonna get bigger. I think we're much further down the road of identifying the culprit that sugar is than we are with animal protein. All of the diets that have followed Atkins, there's been many of them, the South Beach diet, the Dukan diet, they've all kind of had this one theme in common, is that carbs are the problem. Now, what is a carb to the average person? Well, they're probably not thinking about black beans that has carbs, fat, and protein in it. They're thinking about bread. They're thinking about a great big old white bread sandwich with whatever on it. And if you look at history, most populations of the world have depended on grains, legumes, starchy foods for their calories. And that's where they're the cheapest things to eat. And so we eat the vegetables and the fruits when we can find them to get a lot of nutrients that those three don't have. But I've even seen recently data to the effect that one could live indefinitely on nothing but potatoes. And that person would not be obese. That person would be very trim. And these populations of the world that I refer to, when you go to a place that's never been inhabited by the typical Western diet, and you see Asians, for example, when Campbell was over there in the early 80s during the China Project, and finding whole villages of people that ate almost nothing but plant-based foods, and they would eat whatever meat they could find, but they were all thin as they could be, and they were getting their 80% carbs, but they were whole plant carbs. They weren't the kind of carbs that we're talking about. The simple carbs like sugar and bread are definitely not a healthy thing to eat. But the whole thing the whole movement, people lost weight and then they gained it all back. And Atkins himself died an obese man that was very sick. I mean, it's not a healthy way to eat. And it's been proven time and time again. And I've known a lot of people that have lost weight and they run around and buy some new clothes, and I'm telling them you should save your money because you're going to need those old clothes pretty soon. And it's just a shame because they've basically made a guilty person or made a scapegoat out of carbohydrate, which is arguably the most important part of our three nutrients. There's only three of them: carbohydrate, protein, and fat. We need some of all three, but it's carbohydrates that provide most of the energy that has enabled primitive populations to flourish. So it's a shame, but as people learn the truth and commit to a permanent lifestyle change of eating mostly, I say mostly whole plants. I have a system called 4-leaf. 1 leaf over 20% whole plants, 40%, 60%. 4-leaf is over 80% of my diet from whole plant-based foods. And that means, what do you do with the other 20%? Well, you got your alcoholic beverages, you got this and that. But if one is eating at 80% of their calories from whole plants, they'll be at the top 1% of the healthiest people in the world. And it implies a little flexibility. Like, I don't have to be a 100% vegan. I can just eat a whole lot of whole plants and it'll work out. My typical daily diet is pretty easy for me to regurgitate because I've been a single man most of the last 20 years, and when I first got started down the path of healthy eating, I kind of quickly figured out a way that I would eat. And my routine now is I don't eat much of anything until about 9 o'clock. I do have 1 cup of coffee, which I'm not saying it's good or bad. I enjoy it. And then I have a bowl of whole grain oatmeal that I basically eat it cold. I put in half water and half some kind of non-dairy milk, whether it be soy, coconut, or whatever. And I mix that, and while that's kind of soaking, I cut up a bunch of fruit and I put it on top. And I eat that cold. And I learned that trick from Dr. Esselstyn. It's a meal that I look forward to every day. I know that that's done more for me than anything because I always eat that if I'm in my home. Lunchtime and dinner, usually the first year or two on this thing, I was eating out every evening. As a single guy, I would use that as my entertainment, and I would go down to the local restaurant. I'd sit at the bar, and I would order. I'd say, "What kind of vegetables you got? Tell Walter to mix me up a plate." Now, Walter would make me a plate of 2/3 vegetable and 1/3 grain or something like that. And I would eat in the restaurant, and I would maybe get a little bit of whole grain bread on the side, but I would have that every day. And at lunchtime, I started making up batches. I made up batches of black rice and other kinds of, black beans, whole grain rice, brown rice, black rice, and different wild rices. And I would freeze them. I'd make them up into 1 meal containers, and I would freeze like 12 containers. And I would bring out 1 meal every day, and then the next day I would eat that 1 meal. So I always had 1 defrosting. And then I would put on top of that, when I warmed it up, some vegetables in season, whether they be, could be broccoli and spinach, greens, all kinds of vegetables that I just pick up at the store. So when I eat at home, I was getting almost 100% of my calories from whole plant-based foods. When I would go out, it's a little more difficult because they always cook with oil and things like that. But nevertheless, with that routine, I managed to lose 20 pounds I didn't know I had to lose, and never gain it back. And also never going to the doctor. I noticed I used to get sick about twice a year. I would get congested, I'd get a sore throat, I'd get a cough, at least 2 times a year, and it seemed to take me weeks to get over it completely. I'd be coughing and sneezing for weeks. I wouldn't lose much work, but it was just an annoyance. And I realized that it took me several years, I think, for my body to totally cleanse itself. And now, knock wood, it's rare if I get sick. And so, I look at those kind of things. I look at, there's a topic called regularity. One of the first things I noticed was, started eating this way, you don't need any magazines in the restroom anymore because you don't have time to read an article. It comes out fast. And so you go more than once. Some people don't go for, 3 or 4 days. I've heard people sometimes don't go for a week. Well, when you eat whole food plant-based, you go at least once a day and sometimes twice, but we won't dwell on that topic, but you just kind of know that your body is taking care of business. And if I have an accident, I'm the first guy to run to the doctor and get fixed. Great respect for our medical profession. I started down this path because I just got interested about the optimal diet for humans. And after a few years, actually during the first year, I learned also about the enormous impact it has the way we eat, whatever it is. It has an enormous impact on the ecosystem of our planet. And the more humans there are eating this way, the bigger that impact is. I'm talking about eating the meat, dairy, eggs, and fish all the time. It's really become a problem for our ecosystem. It's become a huge problem with climate change. And I've been a blogger, very active blogger for the last 5 years. And I started out, I blogged about every single health issue I could find. And then I started blogging more about the environment. And at one point I concluded that there is nothing more important than sustainability of first our ecosystem, which also sustains our civilization. And if we don't have our civilization, I think life on this planet becomes a living hell for the few of us that survive. And so I truly believe that changing what we eat in a big way, and I'm talking about the 2 billion people of the world that eat 72% of the meat today. But the problem is, even though people in New York City and San Francisco may be moving toward more plant-based eating, away from meat, I extrapolated the data and determined that for every American or European that's moving toward plant-based, there's 10 people in the developing world moving in the opposite direction. We've been burning down rainforests at the rate of over 20 million acres a year since 1970. We are polluting our oceans. We're destroying our topsoil. The biodiversity rate is off the chart, the way we're losing species. And it's reached a point where we're racing past tipping points with regards to the ecology, which means that you can never recover from those type of damages that we're doing to our environment. So my total passion today is about the sustainability aspects of what we're eating as opposed to the health benefits for humans, because the health benefits to humans will shrink to insignificance when there's no water. When there's no water, when there's no food at the supermarket, we're not a bunch of farmers that can go out and grow our own food anymore. When our civilization shuts down, it's going to be a hell on earth, and the people that are going to survive the longest are the people that have guns. And they're going to be able to protect themselves from people that want to steal what food they have left. So to me, I don't worry about somebody that, if they don't want to eat the whole food plant-based diet, just don't eat the animals. Just quit eating the animals and the fish because of the environmental damage that we're inflicting on our only planet. This is the only planet we have. We should have learned from the people on Easter Island that the most remote island on Earth was settled in 500 AD by some Polynesians that came in by some kind of watercraft. They swelled to a population of 15,000 on an island smaller than Catalina Island. And they built a lot of stone gods. They began taking down their trees to build huts for them to live in, to build rope, to build boats for them to fish in. The problem was they didn't connect their lifestyle choices with their ecology that was supporting them. And as a result, their civilization collapsed sometime between 1200 and 1722 when the Dutch found that island and named it Easter Island on Easter Sunday when they found it. and they found a few hundred animal-like human beings running around scrapping for food. It had totally collapsed. There was no civilization anymore. And that's what happens in a isolated environment where they can't get any relief. Well, our isolated environment now is this planet. We're not going to get any relief from Mars and the moon or any other planet. It is up to us to solve this problem. And it's a simple problem, but it's the most difficult problem that I can possibly imagine to get disparate groups around the world and hundreds of religions and hundreds of cultures that go back for generations upon generations to think about changing the diet in with any kind of speed is a huge project, but it can be done. And that's my point. It is possible to get it done. It is impossible to control our population by civil means in any time soon. That's going to continue to grow, and it'll probably take a century or more to get our population under control if the mass riots don't take out hundreds of thousands or millions of people. I hate to sound negative here because I'm so excited about the promise of food. We have something so simple that we get a fringe benefit of being healthy, while at the same time we preserve our ecosystem for our children and indeed all the children of the world and everybody that follows us on this planet. I look at it as, I'm 71 years old. I was born at the beginning of the mess, when the mess really got started at the end of World War II. I was born during the Battle of Iwo Jima. And my mother at the time thought that my eating bacon and eggs was the greatest thing she could do for me, and God bless her soul, she was doing what every other American mother thought. And it's all happened on my watch. In the last 50 years, the human species has inflicted more damage on the fragile harmony of nature than all previous generations of humans combined for 200,000 years. 50 years. So I think we have, those of us that understand it, have a responsibility to do all that they can to make it happen. And that's what I'm trying to do. I don't have the money and I don't have the global recognition, but I'm spending my time trying to recruit and inspire those who do.